The United States is the #1 economy in the world. This has been the status quo for more than half a century, and while it is a symbolic country of capitalism, it is haunted by its great national debt. Debt can be a complex issue to understand, which involves treasury bonds, deposits, domestic debt, and so on, which is why I will try to explain this in the simplest and most practical way possible. The level of the national debt of the United States is a measure that establishes how much the US government owes to its creditors. Since the American government almost always spends more than it receives, the national debt continues to rise steadily. As of the 3rd of January 2019, the US national debt was at $21.97 trillion according to the United States Treasury. It has risen 10% since President Trump took office in January 2017. Under President Obama, the national debt increased by 100%, from $10 trillion to $20 trillion, while the GDP barely increased by 15%. So for the second time in history after World War II, the US national debt is higher than its gross domestic product, surpassing the threshold of 100% of GDP. In short, the US owes more than it produces. Most other developed nations only have a national debt ranging from 60 to 80% of their GDP. Although this is not a rule, it's the general norm for most developed nations. But to what extent is this dangerous for the US and other nations in general? Does this risk the global economy as much as it does the United States? This is what we'll explore today. Let's begin. A government can only spend what they have as budget. Any more than this, then they would have to borrow. In order for the government to continue operating in this case, the Treasury must issue letters, notes, and bonds to make up the difference, finance its excess spending through loans including domestic and foreign investors, as well as corporations, banks, and even other governments. In other words, by issuing these types of securities, the federal government can acquire the cash needed to provide government services. Depending on the reputation of the government of the country in question, banks around the world can offer the government money in exchange for loans. Generally, the better the country's credit reputation, the lower the interest rates, and the more flexible the loan. In general, the public always prefers to lend to the United States than to Venezuela, for example. The US pays their debts well, and it's virtually impossible for them to fail in its debt. This is known as default. The surplus spending of the American government every year is called a deficit, and therefore, these deficits have been accumulating over decades regardless of who's been the president. The national debt always continues to increase because the American government continues to spend more than they earn. Within US law, there is a limit known as the debt ceiling, in which a legal limit is set and doesn't allow the government to spend beyond this point. When the debt ceiling is approaching, Congress usually has to agree to raise the debt ceiling and allow the government to borrow more. If Congress doesn't approve of it, the government could be potentially shut down. The US constantly raises the debt ceiling, a situation that has become the norm, because if the country doesn't keep borrowing, it will not function. A large part of the national debt of a country, in this case of the United States, may come from other entities such as Social Security or even from other federal departments, known as Intragovernmental Debt. And although the same government being in debt with itself seems paradoxical, this is the case with most countries around the world. From there, other governments, especially countries with strong economies, can lend money to each other. This is the case with the US debt, where the largest external creditor of the US is China, which owns approximately 9% of US debt, or a total of $2 trillion, followed by Japan with 8% or $1.8 trillion. But if we talk strictly about the US debt that belongs to a foreign power, this represents 30% of the total debt, and China owns 25% of it. For a long time, it was speculated that China could break the US by charging the debt at any moment. This would not be the case, however. Although China owns a large amount of this debt, collecting the debt doesn't necessarily sink the US into bankruptcy. It should be noted that China, like the US, is also a highly indebted country, with a national debt close to 50% of the Chinese GDP. Charging the debt to the US would only trigger a reciprocal action, since the US also owns some of the Chinese debt. In the instance of Japan, the debt had already reached 220% of their GDP, doubling their entire economy. This is a very dangerous case since the population of Japan is already steadily decreasing every single year. The GDP per capita of the US is one of the highest in the world, currently at around $59,000. However, the debt per capita of an average American is at around $61,000, higher than the GDP per capita. So does this mean that the US citizens owe more money than they have? Technically, yes. But in practice, there is no payment to make. Of the $61,000 that each US citizen owes, at least $40,000 of those dollars is owed to the government, and the other $20,000 to foreign countries, of which China would take $5,000 and Japan $4,000. Technically, while the US continues to pay their debts on time, there would be no problem, even if the debt continues to accumulate. The problem is that many economists argue that an economic model where the government continues to live on deficits is not sustainable over time. Even if the US is the #1 economy on the planet, it is still dangerous to reach 200, 250, or even 350% debt with respect to their GDP. There are multiple rich and developed nations that do not have such a colossal debt as an asterisk to their GDP. Take Luxembourg, for example. Its debt is under 30% of its GDP, New Zealand with 26%, or even Russia with 10%. However, Russia is a special case that we will further delve into in another video, since Russia has their pockets lined with gas and oil. The US has a serious spending problem, especially considering that more than a quarter of the federal budget goes into the US military. The current US debt exceeds $21 trillion, and it is by far the largest in the world. It has increased another $1 billion on average every single year since 2007. The debt grew despite threats from Congress to not raise the debt ceiling. In 2011, the American debt crisis almost forced the US to not pay their debts. In 2012, the fiscal cliff crisis almost halted the government, and in 2013, the US government shut down for 15 days. Since these attempts by Congress did not work, what can and should be done? Essentially, there are 3 ways to reduce the debt and save the US from bankruptcy. First, cut costs. The fiscal ceiling tried to force the government to cut discretionary spending by 10%. No one in Congress thought that this was a good idea. Even with the fiscal ceiling, the debt continued to grow. To really reduce debt, Congress would have to cut spending so severely that it would slow down economic growth. This is because government spending is a very important component of the GDP. It is the most important actor in the economy, as it is the one that spends the most. If the government spends less, there will be less money circulating in the economy. Secondly, increase taxes. The problem is the tax rate is enough to curb incentives to grow businesses and income. The third option is to boost economic growth at a faster rate than debt. An economic growth that exceeds the percentage of growth of the debt would allow the reducing of the ratio between debt and GDP. But the problem is the government doesn't agree on how to grow the economy. Most Democrats will say that higher spending works better, while the majority of Republicans say that lower taxes will drive more growth. Both taxes will definitely increase debt, possibly more than the GDP. But there is another solution. Congress, which approves the budget, should change spending to the areas that generate more jobs. Research shows that spending on bridges, roads, and public buildings generates the highest number of jobs per dollar. The next best thing is to spend on education. Nearly 25% of government spending goes to the military. Contrary to popular belief, that is not the economic boost that World War II had. Instead, it's due to the fact that during the war, the states invested more in technology and equipment. So to reduce debt, the government should instead shift spending from public defense to spending more in public infrastructure and education. This is one of the best ways to structurally create more jobs for the future and in turn grow the economy. The US owes more than 100% of its GDP, a situation that previously happened only during World War II. Today, there's no Great War, but the continuing and eternal military campaigns in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, and other military outbreaks had cost the country more than $5 trillion. President Trump was very vocal about this issue, and it is one of his most agreeable points when he states that the money squandered in the Middle East by destabilizing countries could have been the money used to fund infrastructure and education. This is the step that the White House and Congress must take in order to at least slow down the growth of its national debt. Most creditors do not typically worry until the sovereign debt exceeds 77% of the GDP, according to the World Bank. In the case of the US, that limit was reached years ago. The only way that the US can reduce its debt is if the American people begin to accept austerity measures. The most painless time to do this is when the economy is expanding. That is when the GDP growth rate is above 3% and unemployment is less than 5%. Although in doing so, it could possibly cause a recession. Reducing debt will not be easy, and there are many economic and political points of views, both on the Republican and Democratic side. Both perspectives are valid and there is no 100% correct answer. But one thing is for sure, if the US does not reduce its debt sooner or later, Congress will increase the tax ceiling. If this happens, the US could face a sovereign default and enter bankruptcy, but this would be the most extreme possibility. So what do you think about the sovereign debt of the United States? What do you think could be an appropriate measure in order to reduce the national debt? And could the US go bankrupt? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you next time.